Hi and welcome to John's Maths book. In this video, we're going to be looking at adding, subtracting and multiplying complex numbers. If you like the video, then please hit the like button and I'd be delighted and honoured if you'd subscribe to the channel. Without further ado, let's go over to the whiteboard. Let's look at how we add, subtract and multiply complex numbers. I've put two complex numbers on the whiteboard, Z1 and Z2. Suppose we want to add these. How would we do it? Well, we'd sum the real and imaginary numbers to get a new complex number of the form a plus bi, where a is real and b is imaginary. In our example, z1 plus z2 is equal to the first complex number z1, which is 4 plus 2i, plus the second complex number z2, which is 3 minus 4i. To add these together, we sum the real numbers and then we sum the imaginary numbers. So from Z1, the real number is 4, and from Z2, the real number is 3. And then looking at again at Z1, the imaginary number is 2i, and from Z2, the imaginary number is minus 4i. So adding the real parts, 4 plus 3 gives 7, and the imaginary parts, 2i minus 4i, give minus 2i, and so z1 plus z2 is equal to 7 minus 2i. Similarly, if we now want to subtract z2 from z1, we'd subtract the real numbers and the imaginary numbers to come up with a new complex number of the form a plus bi, where a is the real part and bi the imaginary part. In our example, subtracting z2 from z1, we first subtract the real numbers, so that's 4 minus 3 to give 1, and then we subtract the imaginary numbers, so that's 2i minus 4i, so the two negatives make a positive, so we're left with plus 6i. So z1 minus z2 equals 1 plus 6i. To multiply a complex number by a real number, we distribute the real number to both the real and imaginary parts of the complex number. So let's look at an example of how we do this. So let's suppose we want to multiply z1 by 3. So that would be 3 multiplied by the complex number 4 plus 2i. If we now distribute the real number across the real and imaginary part of the complex number, we have 3 times 4, which gives 12, and 3 times 2i, which gives 6i. So the result of multiplying z1 by 3 is 12 plus 6i. Now let's see what happens when we multiply I by itself. So I multiplied by I will give I squared. Now I is equal to the square root of minus 1. So therefore I squared is the square root of minus 1 multiplied by the square root of minus 1. So multiplying these together gives us minus 1. Now let's look at I cubed. So if I is the square root of minus 1, then I cubed is the square root of minus 1 multiplied by the square root of minus 1 multiplied by the square root of minus 1. So if we take the first two, so the square root of minus 1 multiplied by the square root of minus 1, we get minus 1, and that's multiplied by the remaining square root of minus 1. Now the square root of minus 1 is I, so minus 1 times I gives minus I, and I to the power of 4 is equal to the square root of minus 1 multiplied by the square root of minus 1 multiplied by the square root of minus 1 and multiplied by the square root of minus 1 again. So if we take these in pairs, the square root of minus 1 multiplied by the square root of minus 1 gives minus 1. And then again the square root of minus 1 multiplied by the square root of minus 1 gives us minus 1. So we have minus 1 multiplied by minus 1, which gives us 1. Let's suppose we now want to multiply two complex numbers together. To do this, each part of the first complex number gets multiplied by each part of the second complex number. So when we multiply z1 by z2, we multiply the complex number 4 plus 2i by the second complex number 3 minus 4i. If we now multiply the real part of z1 by z2 and the imaginary part of z1 by z2, we have 4 multiplied into 3 minus 4i plus 2i multiplied into 3 minus 4i. And expanding these brackets, we have 4 multiplied by 3 gives 12. 4 multiplied by minus 4i gives minus 16i. 2i multiplied by 3 gives 6i. And 2i multiplied by minus 4i gives minus 8i squared. Grouping together the terms with I, we have 12, and minus 16i plus 6i gives minus 10i. And we know that I squared is the square root of minus 1 multiplied by the square root of minus 1, which is minus 1. So minus 1 multiplied by minus 8 gives plus 8. And so z1 multiplied by z2 is equal to 20 minus 10i.